Much. I feel very excited to be here. I feel very honored to have been asked. Um, my name is Nathan Lambstrom. I am a ecological garden designer and university lecturer in plant sciences in Southern Rhode Island. Um, I have a small business where I design, install, and do some maintenance and consulting for what I think of as ecological gardening, which could be an entirely other talk. Um, But I've worked in this field either in restoration ecology um, or in ornamental horticulture for nearly 20 years and am now trying to kind of blur the lines between the two. And um, this topic particularly, some of you I know read my Garden Rant article, which I really appreciate. This is somewhat related to that, but this is a departure from that somewhat and is more focusing on something that is has become really important to me. And the more time I think about it, especially living in New England as someone from North Carolina, and that is that I should be paid to hibernate all winter. After this winter, that is first and foremost on my mind. We had a historic blizzard up here. We got about 3 feet of snow. So I'm proposing a nationwide program where gardeners are paid to hibernate throughout the winter. So call your senators, um, get on board for that. No, but I know that a lot of you know the focus of this talk is what I call what we talk about when we talk about invasive species. And so it's focusing primarily on the rhetoric and the language that we use around invasive species. And my thesis basically is invasive species rhetoric is a metaphor that has outlived its usefulness. Um, and I don't say that lightly. And I came to that conclusion after a long time of working and studying in the field. Um, I started off in my career in undergrad very excited about being able to differentiate between invasive and native species and very excited about being able to do something concrete to help what I perceive to be an imperiled ecosystem. And I've come to believe over time, continuing to work with these plants, that the framework that I was given was not reflecting the reality on the ground. Metaphors are very useful in science. You know, we talk about colonies of ants, we talk about food chains. Even the word for a cell is derived from a monk's cell. But I think sometimes we can forget that these are metaphors and they sometimes take on a life of their own. So I want to try and unravel that a little bit in this talk. And I've been told that I have about 4 hours, so I hope that's okay with everybody. I want to say too, before I start, I have a few caveats that I always like to make. This is like those gyms that popped up everywhere in the 90s, a judgment-free zone. I do not begrudge anyone for choosing to use this language. I'm not judging anyone for using this language. Um, I see this as kind of a difference in opinion and in perspective. And that's mostly what I'm hoping to share with you is that these are not hard, concrete scientific realities, that there are complicated subjects and there's different ways to approach them. But I hope that it does not in any way come off that I am um, passing any judgment on anyone who feels differently about this. And there are also several caveats that I always like to make at the beginning of a talk like this. One, first and foremost, is native plants are extremely important. Um, I don't in any way want to be interpreted as saying that there's no value to native plants. I don't want to be interpreted as saying that we should and could replace every native plant with an invasive plant and there would be no consequences. Um, that's not at all my message. Most of my work is with native plants. I don't use exclusively native plants, but I really value them. I teach about them. I use them. But what I have come to believe is that that does not have to mean that non-native plants always have zero ecological value, which I think is sometimes kind of a rhetorical trap that we fall into. It's very easy to see things as black and white. And if we emphasize the value of one, we feel like we need to de-emphasize the value of the other. But what I've come to believe is that the value of native plants does not mean that that's an exclusive trait, and it does not mean that non-native plants have no ecological value. And then the second point I want to make is that competitive plants should still be managed. Plants that we consider invasive, I spend a lot of time in my work managing the spread of those plants, reducing the spread of those plants, weeding them out of gardens where they're affecting garden outcomes. But I don't think that means that they are evil. And I also don't think that means that they should be eradicated at all costs. I'll talk about that more in detail about some of the potential harms of that attitude. But hopefully, I hope that you'll keep that in mind as I talk, that I am not in any way downplaying the value of native plants, and I am not in any way downplaying the potential impacts of invasive plants on goals that we might have for a piece of land. All right. So whenever I talk, I always like to keep myself organized and give you a blueprint for where we're going to go. So we're going to go through three chapters right now. We're going to look at the past, the present, and the future. We're going to start off in the past with where did we get the language that we use to talk about invasive species? We've become somewhat distanced from the origins of this language, and it sometimes feels as if these are kind of permanent scientific terms, but we actually do know exactly where it came from, and they can be traced back to a English zoologist named Charles Elton. Charles Elton was born in 1900. He was an ecologist and zoologist interested primarily in animal population fluctuations and animal population control. So he applied his work primarily to attempting to mitigate potential damage of increases in populations of rodents during World War II. Food supply in England was scarce and of the utmost importance, and so he gained some respect and prominence in his work on controlling the spread of these rodent populations. His graduate work focused on lemming population growth specifically. And if you are like me, you grew up with cartoons of lemmings flinging themselves from cliffs. And Charles Elton is actually where we got this myth about lemmings throwing themselves off of cliffs. Elton had an idea that lemmings and all other species have relatively fixed ranges. And when he was doing his work in Scandinavia, he came across an account of lemmings swimming from landmass to landmass across the fjords, which was not a behavior they were known to exhibit regularly. And so he surmised that when lemmings reach their population capacity in a space, some of them will sacrifice themselves for the good of the population as a whole. That's never been observed. We know that that's not the case, and that they're actually migrating and increasing their ranges. But those ideas of fixed ranges, those fixed ideas that are somewhat similar to ideas that we have around what invasive species are doing, can lead to some difficulty conceptualizing things like natural range expansion. And interestingly, and somewhat shockingly, ideas like that can persist for quite a while, to the extent that um, Disney created a movie called White Wilderness, which was looking at Arctic ecology. And they wanted so badly to be the first ones to capture images of these lemmings throwing themselves from cliffs that they actually put some into a truck and dumped them off of a cliff. They have since apologized for it and tried to scrub this video from the record, but it is one small example of how a fixed idea like that can lead to some strange perceptions. So, where we got this invasion rhetoric directly can be traced back to a book that was published by Elton after World War II. He published a book called The Ecology of Invasions by Animals and Plants and created an accompanying BBC radio series. He coined the term invasive to describe these plants, and he very explicitly and directly chose a military term. It was after World War II. The nation was recovering from war. He himself was undoubtedly recovering from trauma that he went through in the war. And so he said very clearly he's using that language to try and grab attention for what he saw as a very important problem. So that is the language that we've inherited today, the military metaphors of invaders knocking down the gates. Um, which brings us to then what is the scientific definition of an invasive species? So if we've inherited this metaphor, what is the scientific definition of an invasive species? Well, invasion biology is the study of the establishment, spread, and effects of species introduced to new environments. But is there a scientific definition of invasive? In other words, these four plants at the bottom of the screen, could I test or measure them in a quantifiable way to determine whether they are invasive? If I dropped you in an ecosystem that you had never been in before with plants that you had no familiarity with, what definition or what test could you use to assess what was invasive and what was not? It's very similar to the question, which I'm sure you all know the answer to, what is the scientific definition of a weed? And the answer is there is not one. Each of these four plants at the bottom have been considered weeds in different places and contexts. Three of them have been considered invasive in different places and contexts. But a weed, as I'm sure you all know, is a subjective cultural definition that reflects our preferences and varies widely by geographic location and land use context. We would probably all agree that knotweed on the far left is a weed and is invasive because it spreads rapidly and causes harm. Queen Anne's lace, we might have some disagreement. Canada goldenrod being a native, we might not be sure. Butterfly weed is really only retaining the name weed because of the effect that it had on cow pastures. It's toxic to cows, and so it's retained that moniker of a weed, even though very few of us would consider that to be a weed today. So there is no scientific, measurable, quantifiable definition of invasive. There would be no way to go into an unknown ecosystem, take a plant, measure its growth, measure how it's interacting with other plants in the ecosystem, and determine conclusively that this plant is invasive and is causing harm to the native plants around it. The definition that is often used by government agencies, by conservation groups, by any working body that's working with invasive species is something that spreads rapidly. So if we look at our four plants at the bottom, that eliminates butterfly weed. That is not a rapid spreader. We still have Canada goldenrod, which does spread quite rapidly. Queen Anne's lace, which can spread effectively from seed. Knotweed, which very clearly spreads rapidly. Has been introduced outside of its native range. So it's something that spreads rapidly and is not growing where it evolved, but has been introduced into a new habitat by humans. So that, by this definition, would eliminate Canada goldenrod. Something that is growing within its native range by this criteria would not be considered invasive and is causing measurable, usually considered economic harm. Harm is particularly tricky to quantify. Oftentimes, what we think of as harm is more accurately described as change. And so we have to define benchmarks to determine what is harm. So decrease in diversity of species, we would consider harmful. The shorthand that most agencies will use is economic harm because that's easy to put a number on. It would be hard to make a case that Queen Anne's lace is causing measurable or economic harm. It is spread along roadsides. It is causing some small change in the floral composition along highway medians, but it would be difficult to make a case that it is causing harm. So by this criteria, the only plant that's left that would be considered invasive is our knotweed. It spreads rapidly, it's been introduced outside of its native range, and it is causing measurable harm in terms of damage to structures, in terms of alteration to ecosystems. The problem is that the traits that we use to describe invasiveness are not unique to non-native species. So we have our three criteria, something that is introduced outside of its native range, something that is rapid, spreading with competitive growth, and something that causes measurable damage. We have many native species with a rapid spread and a competitive growth rate that is quite comparable to many of our invasive species like Canada goldenrod and cattails. That's why both of these are sometimes considered invasive by conservation agencies even within their native range. We have many species that cause measurable damage. So in addition to something like Canada goldenrod and cattail changing the biodiversity of a space, we can have economic damage in the form of milkweed, a desirable ecological gardening plant that can bring down the value of a hay crop for cattle because it's toxic to cattle, damage to human health from ragweed, which is a native plant, which can cause harm to human health in the form of allergies. And then we can have plants that have both rapid spread and measurable damage, like our trumpet creeper, which can drive down diversity and cause damage to structures, or poisonous water hemlock, which can cause damage to human health and can spread rapidly and preclude the growth of other species. The only trait that is unique to plants that we consider invasive that they do not share with any other native plant is that they descended from plants that evolved elsewhere. There's no trait, no biological trait, ecological trait that you can ascribe to every invasive plant that is not also shared by some native plants, which I think means that it's time to kind of reevaluate this definition and see if we can come up with a more complex way of talking about these plants. What I think has happened over the years is we've had what I call definition creep. So, what started off as a term to describe introduced plants naturalizing outside of their native range, I don't think it was Charles Elton's intent to create a sensationalist term that would cause people to then want to do battle with these plants. I think his intention was to describe a natural phenomenon in a way that was exciting and attention grabbing to draw more attention to his field. But what started as a term that was an attempt to describe introduced plants naturalizing outside their range becomes a subjective term, which is vague and somewhat variable, that feels objective. So it feels scientific, it feels indisputable, it feels permanent because it's the language that's used in science. I have a published paper that has invasive in the title. It's an easy shorthand, so I don't fault anyone for using it. But I think the problem is that it is a hard definition to pin down, and yet it feels like one that is very permanent. And to give you examples of that, we've got some plants like Cirsium discolor. This is a native thistle. It's very useful to a lot of native bees. It has a lot of value as a pollen source to a lot of specialist bees. It is native everywhere in the United States where it grows, but is listed as an invasive plant in Iowa because of the farm industry there and the damage that it can cause to the farm industry. Nelumbo lutea, the yellow lotus, where you live, is considered a native plant, and so much so that it is considered an endangered plant in New Jersey, but a few counties over in Connecticut it is listed as an invasive plant because it did not, to the best of our knowledge, grow there historically, has been moved outside of its range. So it is somewhat of a vague and subjective term, and that allows it to be ascribed to a very wide range of species that ultimately do not have very much in common in terms of their biology, their ecology, and their real effects. To me, it's not a useful term if we can use it to describe native cattails and Canada goldenrod, but also dandelions and clovers, and also knotweed and other things that do have very rampant spread. Ultimately, what it leaves us with is language that leaves no room for nuance. So if we can call any of these plants invasive, and people do readily describe dandelions and clovers as invasive, I think it would be difficult to make a case that they are causing harm. It's an interesting one where they've been here long enough that they have accumulated a lot of ecological relationships. But people do frequently describe them as invasive simply because they are not native and they spread freely. When we give that label to a plant like that, it's very hard for us to then look at the nuance of the actual interactions that that plant is having with the land history that it's in and with the species that it's sharing environment with. And then we end up with sort of extreme descriptions of behaviors of these plants that the plants themselves are not actually capable of in any way. I'm sure you've all seen, and it's not hard to find, descriptions of these plants as monsters and thugs. We talk about doing battle with invasive, waging war on invasives. Here we've got an example of an invasive grass using chemical warfare to crowd out native species. The only species that's capable of battling and engaging in chemical warfare is members of our species. So we're ascribing traits that we have that are shameful to these plants in an attempt to drum up sentiment against them. But it's not an accurate description of what's happening on the ground. And I think it can cause us to not quite see the picture very clearly. All right. So that's where we've been. That's where we got this language to talk about invasive species. Now I will talk about the present, where we are now, why I think this is a problem at all. So I talk about this quite a lot, and I know a lot of people disagree with me. And I know one of the disagreements is, well, yes, it doesn't quite reflect reality, but it's still communicating something important. It's still getting people excited about managing these plants, which is important. And so maybe it doesn't matter if we are not leaving room for nuance. But what I have seen is that language that leaves no room for nuance is affecting our perceptions of what's happening, and it can cause real harm. So when we use loaded language and war metaphors, it's very hard not to then introduce some bias against a plant like that from the outset. If we're talking about it engaging in chemical warfare, if we're talking about battling it or a thug or a monster, it's going to be very hard to then say, but it's also providing some habitat for an endangered bird, or but some native pollinators have adapted to use it as a larval host plant. And this is something that has been noticed by a lot of professionals in invasion biology and in ecology generally. And there has been an increasing number of scientists calling for a rethinking of the way that we approach these plants and the way that we talk about these plants. These are all articles. If anyone's interested in this, I would be happy to send these out. But any of these is a very good entry point into some of the changing sentiments among academics on how this language has kind of gotten away from us. I think one of the best ones, if you're interested, is this Don't Judge Species on Their Origins piece, authored by Mark Davis and a number of other ecologists. Um, it's very grounded. It has a lot of reference literature examples, and Mark Davis wrote the book on invasion biology. So he takes this stuff very seriously. So I think that one of the core problems is that unscientific language like this can affect public interpretation of results. So even if results are presented clearly in a scientific paper, the way that then that is presented in a public media outlet and the way that's then interpreted gets distorted and somewhat exaggerated. So as an example, we know it's been demonstrated many times that native woody plants, on average, can feed more butterfly moth larvae than non-native species. That is indisputable. What it's been interpreted to mean is that non-native species, and especially invasive species, have zero ecological value and pollinators cannot use them. You see this all the time. I have a friend who has a business very similar to mine, and they post quite often a plant this, not that. Um, and the other day they posted to plant serviceberry instead of calorie pear. I think there's a lot of reasons to plant serviceberry. I love serviceberry. I'm not a fan of the fragrance of calorie pear. But one of the examples they gave was that serviceberry supports pollinators and calorie pear does not. I was curious, and so I looked under the host records database, which is an international database of all of the known species that will feed on these plants within our region, and they feed the exact same number of species. They are relatively closely related in Rosaceae. Pears are not native to North America. They have been here for a fairly long time, and so they have accumulated a lot of ecological relationships. But because of the way we talk about invasive species, it's very easy to ignore that and to assume that they do not. What we do know is that non-native and even invasive plants can and do provide ecological support to many insects and other animals. They can provide support in the form of nectar and pollen plants. Butterflies are nectar generalists. They are not picky about where they get their nectar from. Most bees, around 80%, are nectar or pollen generalists. They show preference more for flower shape and type. We know that many endangered bees, this is an endangered golden northern bumblebee here, Bombus fervidus on the right-hand side. It very frequently utilizes introduced clovers as a very important source of nectar and pollen. They are being used as seeds and fruits for birds. So birds are typically generalists on a fruit type if they are consuming fruits, either dry fruits in the form of dry seeds, or fleshy fruits, large fruits, or small fruits. Most of our woody invasive species are in fact dispersed by birds who regularly consume their fruits. So much so that cedar waxwings, which are perhaps the poster children for frugivorous birds, have changed the color of their wax in areas where they have adopted honeysuckle to become a more important part of their diet. Um, there have been some studies that compare nutritional value of invasive versus non-native plant or invasive versus native plants. They looked at a very small subset of plants and found that honeysuckle and I believe multiflora rose and perhaps bittersweet have lower nutritional value than dogwoods and viburnums, but there are still native plants that similarly have lower nutritional value. Winterberry is a beloved native plant. I love winterberry. I plant it in my yard. But the reason birds tend to save it as a post-migration food in the winter is because that has relatively low nutritional value. It is low in fat. It is mostly starches and carbohydrates, like many of these invasive plants. There's no data that indicates that consumption of those berries of invasive plants is in any way harming these birds. And there is, in fact, data that indicates that the presence of a plant like honeysuckle can increase consumption of native plants like dogwood by serving as a draw for that plant. So, in areas where it is abundant, it is possibly increasing seed dispersal of native plants that are left. So, again, unfortunately, there are no simple narratives. It's all incredibly complicated, incredibly interwoven, like everything else in ecology. Even larval host plants. So there are some invasive species that are even serving as larval host plants for our native butterflies and moths. Um, we are now, I think, fairly well aware that butterflies and moths rely often on a relatively small subset of plants as caterpillars in order to feed. Most of them, around 75%, are specialists on one family or genus. That's often regardless of origin. So oftentimes, if a species of butterfly can feed on a genus of native plant, there is a good chance that it will be able to feed on a species that is within that same genus. This is also incredibly complicated. We know now that preferences can vary across ranges, can vary between different species, and that they can adapt very quickly. What we do know, and what I will say again, is that on average, native woody plants feed more native insects. That means that if you were to close your eyes and walk into a nursery and grab a native plant, there's a good chance that it would feed more Lepidopteran larvae than a non-native plant. There are a few outlier genera that are rock stars. So the oaks, birches, cherries, and willows are all capable of feeding well over 400 species of Lepidopteran larvae. Asters and goldenrods, over 100. Herbaceous plants generally are not host plants for very many species of butterfly and moth the way that woody plants are. Um, but these are also very important as pollen sources from native bees that need pollen from specific plants. However, there are also some native genera that host very few. So Fothergilla, Itea, Cladrastis, depending on the source you look at, there are no confirmed species of butterfly or moth that will use those plants as host plants on the East Coast. Adiantum, Chrysogonum, Polypodium. These are all native plants. I think I have every single one of these in my garden. I love these plants. They are not serving as host plants for native butterflies and moths. But that does not mean that they are not worth planting or have no value. They have other ecological relationships with other insects. They have value in their own right as living creatures. All this means is that no lepidopteran species has evolved a way around their defenses. Um, we forget sometimes that plants do not necessarily want to be eaten. We talk about host-plant relationships as kind of like a harmonious interplay, but there's actually sort of a um, struggle between a plant and an insect. The plant is attempting to evolve anti-herbivory defenses. The insect is attempting to evolve around it. That is why if we have a non-native plant that is closely related to a native plant, there's a better chance that that plant will be able to serve as a host plant because it will have similar defenses that those native insects will have already evolved ways around. One of the best sources, and there is an updated source of this, and so I'll need to update this soon. One of the best sources for this information is a paper by Doug Tallamy in 2009 called Ranking Lepidopteran Use of Native versus Introduced Plants. There's a data set that is an appendix to this paper, which I find incredibly useful when I'm making plant selections for gardens that I'm designing if my goal is to provide a lot of support for butterflies and moths. It shows that at the genus level, oaks, cherries, willows, birches, poplars, apples support an incredibly high number of lepidopteran species, an incredibly high number of native species. Herbaceous plants, again, generally support far fewer, but you can see plants like clovers, which are genus Trifolium, are capable of supporting well over 100. Corn, um, possibly a study artifact because that's an agricultural plant, has been studied quite extensively, supports over 100. Goldenrods and asters. So this is a very useful data set for making those decisions sometimes. Um, but it also is useful for seeing that there are plenty of non-native plants that are providing ecological support. So if you look down this list on the left-hand side, you'll see that in the top 15 or so are the non-native pears. So there are 119 known species of lepidopterans that can use pears as a host plant. Um, that means that if your goal is caterpillar support and you tear out a pear and put in an ITEA, it is possibly counterproductive. You have potentially taken away a food source and provided something that will not provide a great deal of food. Within this data set also, we can see that many of the plants that we consider to be invasive are known to support a non-zero number of pollinators. None of them are supporting as many as our oaks. Nothing can beat the oaks, but even things like porcelainberry, barberry, bittersweet, privet, they can support a dozen or so species of native caterpillar. Clovers, having been here for centuries and having quite a few species on the East Coast, have accumulated 115 species of native caterpillars that will feed on them. So they are providing very real, very high ecological value to the point where some insects have switched over to the point that they are somewhat reliant on introduced and even invasive species. Black swallowtail larvae now feed significantly on dill, fennel, and Queen Anne's lace, and in some places seem to prefer that to native Apiaceae or dill family members like Zizia. That again varies across the range, as with all these species, but it also does not mean that there's anything wrong with Zizia. It means that there is something about dill and fennel that they have not evolved strong enough anti-herbivory defenses to stop black swallowtail larvae from consuming them. One of the things that we talk about with invasive plants and non-native plants as a negative is that they are not participating in the food web. So sometimes when I talk about this, people seem disappointed. But I think that this should be exciting and it should be interesting and it should be good news that these plants are being slowly integrated into the ecosystem. Insects are beginning to consume them, and that is probably having some effect on their population spread over time. This little butterfly in the middle is a Taylor's checker spot butterfly. Their larvae feed almost exclusively on plants in the Scrophulariaceae family. Historically, in their range, that meant a parasitic plant called a paintbrush. That is very hard to grow in a nursery setting. So a conservation organization that wanted to support this butterfly struggled for years to find a good propagation protocol to get enough paintbrush plants to plant out to support this plant. Then, during the course of that project, someone realized that larvae of this insect had adapted to start feeding on non-native plantains, which grow as weeds. And so, to their credit, the conservation organization switched to growing plantains and now are relying on that plantain to bolster the numbers of this endangered butterfly. There's another endangered butterfly called the Henry's elfin that historically fed on redbuds and hollies, but made the switch, I think, in the 1960s. It adapted something about its metabolism to consume buckthorn plants, and its population numbers are increasing measurably because of the abundance of buckthorn that it's able to feed on. I think the way that we talk about invasive plants makes it tempting to ignore or downplay those examples because we're thinking of this as a binary. We're thinking of it as being all or nothing. But it is, again, unfortunately, very complicated. If we focus entirely on eradication at all costs, we could have some negative effects on these species, and it makes it harder for us to see these ecological relationships forming. It is not to mention also valuable innumerable services like erosion control, carbon sequestration, water filtration, stormwater management, climate change mitigation. We live in a rapidly changing climate, and there are very real ecological services that these plants can and do provide in that regard. So, again, native plants are extremely important, and non-native plants can have ecological value. Sometimes effects matter more than origins. Um, and I think if we can look more clearly at the effects that these plants are having and less stridently on their origins, we might get a more interesting, more exciting, more holistic picture about what's happening in the landscape. Um, I think another problem with the binary language is it can lead us to misinterpret results. It's something that we hear quite often that Japanese barberry is hosting ticks. That comes from a study that looked at abundance of ticks in barberry patches and patches that have been cleared of barberry. So the message we get is barberry hosts more ticks than native shrubs, but the study actually did not ever look at tick presence on native shrubs. What the study found was that barberry hosts more ticks compared to an area without any shrub form vegetation. So the results of this study are control of barberry can help reduce ticks, but it did not say anything specific about the habitat of barberry for ticks compared to native shrubs. Similarly, garlic mustard is presented as an ecosystem destroyer. In some cases, we talk about it wiping out native species, but Mark Davis, who I mentioned earlier, did a long-term study of garlic mustard in Minnesota oak woodlands and found no evidence of it negatively affecting other species. And he determined as a result that it is more a product of change to a woodland than an agent of it. So previous disturbance to the woodland is potentially causing increases of garlic mustard versus the garlic mustard itself going in and creating these monstrous changes. And then we even have this one I always hesitate to bring up because this is a very hot topic right now. We have the spotted lanternfly. Everyone knows about the spotted lanternfly. It's very showy. We're told to stomp them, and the common message is that they are destroying our ecosystems. This headline over here says we can finally unite once more over a common enemy, which to me is very telling and a little funny. But the reality is that scientists have learned that lanternflies are not as harmful as once feared. They will feed on a wide range of plants, but they typically do not kill trees. They are not likely to harm humans or pets directly. They are a nuisance, but the language that we have has people in this quote here dumping all sorts of pesticides and not following proper procedures or even lighting things on fire to get rid of them because we've been told that this is a very extreme case. What we know now is that they are a very real threat to crops, especially to grape crops, and they should be managed in that regard. But we've gotten an inflated sense of the damage that they can cause. So, to stress again, competitive, disruptive plants and insects should absolutely be managed where necessary and realistic, but invasive rhetoric does not reflect ecological reality. And so again, I sometimes get asked, but why is that harmful? So if the end result is still to stop a spotted lanternfly, what does it matter if we've exaggerated the effects? And the problem is that an eradicate at all costs mentality, um, to continue the military metaphor, results in collateral damage. So people will put up things like these sticky traps in an attempt to catch and stop spotted lanternflies. These will catch all manner of insects, native or otherwise, and even in some cases have been known to catch birds. So these are by no means recommended as a method to stop these insects. But if we're led to believe that this is a very extreme threat, we'll be willing to take drastic measures. Some collateral damage can be in the form of removing species providing ecological support. Tamarisk or salt cedar is a very interesting shrub that has become common in the desert Southwest, particularly in areas where rivers have been dammed and salt levels have increased in the soil as a result of lack of natural flooding. There was a long-standing attempt to eradicate these plants, in part to restore the habitat of this endangered bird, the willow flycatcher. And then it was realized that the willow flycatcher was using the tamarisk as habitat. So potentially eradication of that tamarisk, had it continued, would have harmed the bird who was intended to be helped by the control measures. One that is very real that I see quite often that can result in collateral damage is the misapplication of herbicides. One thing that goes hand in hand a lot with discussions on invasive plants is the necessity of using herbicides to manage their spread. I have a lot of thoughts and opinions on this, but I think that where it becomes a problem is when we're willing to do things drastically because the threat is considered so severe. This is no disrespect intended to Dana Milbank. He is very enthusiastic about this topic, but it worries me that an article gets published on how I learned to love toxic chemicals. And there's an anecdote in there about spraying, I believe, Roundup from a drone, which inevitably has collateral damage on non-target plants all around. I have worked for conservation organizations that encouraged me to spray a stronger than prescribed dose of herbicides without any training as a young professional, because of the threat of invasive plants. I know of a land trust near me that is willing to use non-wetland rated herbicides within a wetland boundary because it's very important to them to get rid of Japanese knotweed. And we know that that has very direct negative effects on amphibians and other aquatic life. There is another piece of collateral damage that I want to say before I mention it, that absolutely in no way, shape, or form is this an accusation on anyone who uses language around invasive species. I do not think that people who use this language necessarily hold these views, but I do think it's important to be aware that it can be potentially harmful. And that is that the language that we use about invasive species echoes dangerous rhetoric that is being used about people. So conversations about illegal immigration often refer to aliens, often refer to an invasion or a flood or a tide or a horde. And those are all words that we also hear when we talk about invasive plants and insects. And we know that this has real harm and real negative effects on people in those communities who hear that language and are affected by it. So again, I do not in any way believe, and I do not want anyone to interpret me as saying that if you talk about invasive species, it means that you are engaging in racist dialogue. What I'm saying is that we should be aware of how it sounds. And when it's echoing in the year 2026, some very dangerous and harmful rhetoric, I think it's worth reconsidering how that sounds. One other piece that is very personal to me, I don't know if anyone heard my kids getting ready for bed. They are very loud, but I have young children, and I'm very aware of my job in shaping their perception of the world around them. They live in a relatively wooded area. They have a lot of access to nature, but we also have some areas near us that have a lot of plants that would be considered invasive. Other children aren't as lucky as they are and live in areas that are more, let's say, ecologically degraded. Um, and I don't want my children, I'm also an educator of young children. I don't want my children or those children growing up thinking that the natural areas around them are full of garbage or full of evil monsters. Um, we know that children will distance themselves from anything that they find to be overwhelming. And so one of the quickest ways I think to have them shut down is to point out monsters everywhere and to point out bad things all around them. I would rather encourage them to be curious and to be compassionate and then still to respond appropriately when necessary. Okay, so all of that being said, where do we go from here? So if we're not going to talk about these things in the way that we have, how do we talk about them instead? I think that we should use language that considers root causes. Invasive rhetoric gives agency to plants. Plants can't actually invade. They cannot plan an invasion. They cannot intentionally invade a space where they did not previously occupy. Um, and it obscures the conditions that led to their thriving. So, conditions that led to their thriving were colonization of the Americas by Europeans and plant introductions Many of those plants were brought here intentionally, industrial agriculture, the negative effects of that, habitat fragmentation, and any other form of ecological degradation. I think it's a lot more useful to think of these plants as symptoms of a disturbed and neglected ecosystem instead of as monsters causing harm to the ecosystem. And what I like to encourage people to do is to consider land use history. Um, I think that sometimes when we look at a picture like the one on the right, we have a very short memory and we assume that that was a high quality intact woodland a short time ago and that these plants came in and destroyed it. So this is from my graduate work. These are woodlands that have a lot of buckthorn in the Midwest. And on the left-hand side is the restored state, or what we think is the historic state. And so I've prepared a very high-tech animation to show you what I think is normally the perception of what we imagine happens. We imagine that we have this very high-quality woodland that is intact, and then an invasive species like buckthorn comes in and ruins it. But we forget a very long history of changes to that land. So those woodlands on the left were in some ways created and in very real ways maintained by Native Americans who would manage them for agriculture, for travel, for hunting, for settlements. And all of that changed with European settlement of those places, starting with fire suppression. Fires were necessary to the health of those woodlands, deforestation, grazing, plowing, secondary deforestation after farms were abandoned, and then development and habitat fragmentation. So all of those things, centuries of disturbance combined with plant introductions, create conditions for plants like buckthorn to thrive. But invasive rhetoric gives them agency, and it makes it easy for us to ignore the root causes that led to their thriving. And one very important thing to remember is that correlation does not equal causation. So oftentimes we see a woodland like buckthorn that has lower plant diversity. It's easy to assume that the buckthorn drove down the plant diversity. And in some cases, it certainly is capable of doing so. But it is also very likely that that plant diversity was driven down by centuries of land management choices and changes to that land that then created an open niche that allowed that buckthorn to thrive. If we just remove that plant and don't restore any of those processes or that the native plants that we want to see, there's a very good chance that it will return right back to the buckthorn state because we haven't addressed those underlying root causes. And I like to think about this as don't blame the mushroom. So if you're like me, sometimes you get lost in internet rabbit holes, and one that somehow I got lost in, and then my entire social media algorithm was feeding me for months, was people posting pictures of mushrooms in mushroom identification groups that were growing out of walls in their house. And they would say, "What is this mushroom? And is it bad?" And inevitably, the answer was, it doesn't matter what it is definitely bad. Um, but the way that I think we approach invasive species would be if I had mushrooms growing out of my walls, instead of thinking that there is water damage that has created underlying conditions to allow those mushrooms to thrive, I instead become very angry at the mushrooms. And I rip out every single mushroom and assume that that's going to address the problem. But just like with invasive species, we have to address the underlying condition that created the thriving of those plants or those mushrooms. So correlation does not equal causation in most of these cases. Oftentimes the causation is obscured, and we need a clearer picture of the land use history in order to understand how we got there. I think it is much more useful to see a woodland with buckthorn and to imagine that as an indicator of a damaged landscape rather than a cause of the damage itself. These are competitive plants that are responding to an abused landscape regardless of origin. So the woods behind my house are full of greenbrier. It is impossible for me to walk through without getting scratched. That is a native vine, but it is thriving there and forming a near monoculture at the exclusion of other plants because this was sheep pasture for hundreds of years. So it was grazed, the native seed bank was undoubtedly lost, and a depleted seed bank was then abandoned, and what grew back was a competitive plant like greenbrier. So rather than blaming this plant, I think it's more useful to see it as an indicator of change. So Language that considers root causes, I like to think of a non-native plant as instead an introduced plant because any of them that are here that are not native were necessarily introduced here by us. But then we also need something to describe their behavior because we know not all non-native plants behave the way that we consider an invasive plant. And for this, I have to get very nerdy. So the life strategy theory in ecology proposed by J. Philip Grime describes plants based on their tolerance of stress and disturbance, and it groups them into three broad categories. They are considered either competitors, stress tolerators, or rooterals. So if I can take you back to school for a moment, on the x-axis here, we have stress. So a low stress environment is one where nutrients are abundant, water is abundant, and a low disturbance environment is one where there is not any regular major change to the soil seed bank or to the composition of the plant community. So stress is basically nutrient and water availability, resource availability. Disturbance can be thought of as if it's human caused, plowing, digging, salting roadsides, compaction, fragmentation. Natural disturbance would be fire, grazing, trampling, scouring floods, hurricane blowdowns. So a low stress, low disturbance environment would be an intact open meadow system, or a wetland is the best example of a low stress, low disturbance environment. That favors competitive plants that spread by rhizomes to consume a lot of resources and take up a lot of space. That's why wetlands are so often full of very large mono stands of one species. A low stress, high disturbance environment is one where nutrients and resources are readily available, but disturbance is very high. So there's very rapid turnover of that plant community. The best example of that artificially is a vegetable garden or a farm. Nutrients are freely available to support the vegetables. Disturbance is very high in the form of plowing. So all of our agricultural weeds are rooterals. Their life strategy is to live fast and die young. So they consume the resources that are available. They produce abundant seeds, put those back into the seed bank, and then die. So they're often annuals and biennials. A high stress environment is one where water is limiting or nutrients are limiting. Um, the desert is a very good example of a high stress environment. And if stress is high and disturbance is low, it will favor stress tolerant plants. So they will grow long tap roots. They will spend a long time accumulating resources like a saguaro cactus until they are able to reproduce. Any of our native plants can fall somewhere along this spectrum and can be described in terms of their behavior as rooteral or competitive or stress tolerant or some combination of the three. And the same is true for our non-native plants. So invasive plants like Japanese stiltgrass are very rooteral plants. They are annuals. They produce copious seed. They are short-lived. They thrive on disturbance. Garlic mustard is a biennial, similarly thrives on disturbance. Given enough time without disturbance, it will eventually disappear and lose way to longer-lived perennials. Mugwort is a highly competitive rooteral that relies on disturbance and relies on a low stress environment to occupy a large amount of ground. So my personal preference is to talk about these plants as being introduced and competitive. So I am not de-emphasizing the potential impacts they can have. Competitive plants, native and otherwise, can take up large amounts of space, can make it harder for other plants to gain ground. Um, Others who have thought about this a great deal longer than I have prefer to use disease metaphors. So they think of the ecosystem as being ill, and these are symptoms of the illness. They talk about ecologically disruptive plants. There is a special focus lately on de-emphasis of place names. So not talking about Asian carp or Japanese knotweed, but coming up with other names for those plants so that we're not necessarily focusing on their origins and we're not potentially echoing discrimination against people. Um, and then very interestingly, a lot of Native American scholars talk about these plants as displaced plant relatives. Um, One of the things that changed my mind the most quickly about this was when I worked for a Native American tribe in Washington State, and I had expected them to be very excited as I was at the time about invasive plant management. I thought that they, of anybody, would be very enthusiastic about this. And obviously, like any group, there is a wide diversity of opinions within Native American peoples. Um, but there seems to be a common thread among a lot of people of thinking of these plants as displaced relatives. So Dr. Jessica Hernandez is a Mayan scholar who says we acknowledge them as displaced relatives since at the end of the day they are also someone's plant relatives. Removing them without in good intent or connecting causes scars. And then a Dakota conservation organization, Wakang Tipi Awanyakapi, on their website says we still remove displaced plant relatives to increase biodiversity. We accept it as necessary, but we want to respect these displaced relatives, celebrate them for what they provide, and acknowledge the value that they hold. So I think that's a very good example of how we can still act, we can still engage with management of these plants in this ecosystem, but do it from a place of more compassion and more nuance. Um, and one of the last things I'll leave you with is what I think is a good example of the fact that um, we know that it's possible to do this because we're already doing it with chestnut blight. So chestnut blight is a fungus that was introduced outside of its native range, spread rapidly, caused very measurable harm in the form of almost total eradication of native chestnuts. But because it's not a charismatic, visible presence in the landscape, we don't talk about it as evil. We don't talk about it as a monster. We know that it is causing problems, and we are still working to address those problems. So I think it would be more helpful and useful if we can expand that to other plants. If you are interested in this, these are three books that I would highly recommend. The Next Great Migration by Sonia Shah talks about the human element of this as well. The Rambunctious Garden by Emma Maris. And then my most recent favorite is The Inheritors of the Earth by Chris Thomas, an ecologist who talks about these plants as new evolutionary lineages in a very changing world. Um, so just to stress again before we go, native plants are extremely important. Competitive plants should be managed. That doesn't mean non-native plants always have zero ecological value, and that doesn't mean invasive plants are evil and should be eradicated at all costs. What I would like for us to try and get to is away from eradicating invasives and more towards managing the impacts of these plants while the ecosystem adapts to their presence, which is the only realistic option of the two. Those plants absolutely live here now. We are not putting Phragmites back. We are not putting Rosa rugosa back. We're not putting Japanese honeysuckle back. The only way forward is to manage their impacts while we curiously study the way the ecosystem adapts to their presence. So, what I would invite you to do is consider root causes, consider behavior and not origin, consider collateral damage, and most of all, engage with curiosity about how these plants are integrating into our landscapes. So, with that, I think I've talked quite enough. I may have gone over a little bit, but thank you very much. Um, I really appreciate your time.
Well, that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you, Nathan. Um, and quite eye-opening. I would like to ask people to unmute and take turns asking our speaker questions. So go ahead.
Thank you, Olivia.
Can someone unmute and say hello just to make sure they?
Yes. Hello, I unmuted. I was gonna let somebody else have a first chance at questions, but if nobody else has some, I have some. So,
Great.
so I'm sure you've encountered, all the same, we'll just call them zealots, native zealots that, what is the reaction when you give these talks that you've had?
It's mixed. Um,
Mhm.
Generally, I think the reaction that I find most interesting is some people are relieved.
Mm-hmm.
There's a little bit of a relief to find a new framework and a new way forward. Some people are upset, and some people, I think, and I completely understand why, some people misinterpret me, which is why I include all those caveats,
Mm-hmm.
as saying that there's no importance of native plants. But I really empathize with and understand. the zealots because that's how I started. I was very excited about the value of native plants, and I was very determined to eradicate invasive plants. So I very much understand that perspective. And I think in some ways it makes sense. I think a lot of us are, whether we know it or not, we're having like kind of an ecological grief response. There's a lot of rapid change in our ecosystems, and it's hard to know what to do about it.
Mhm.
And it makes complete sense to me that like that framework um, gives comfort and it gives a way to understand the world.
Yeah, I think, but as your talk demonstrated well, everything has shades of gray. Nothing is black and white, and certainly not the plant world ever, because ask, two gardeners an opinion and you get three answers, right?
Yeah.
And that's every part of the gardening world, not just the native versus invasive thing. So
Right.
yeah, it's going to be even super more complicated. And the more you get into it, the more complicated it is. And I was going to say, I read The Rambunctious Garden when it came out several years ago, and just seeing all the blowback against Emma Maris. I mean, people just would love to like hang her in effigy, like just for having written the book,
Yeah.
is crazy what I see some of it. So I'm glad to see your work.
Thank you. Thank you. And yeah, I think that she was, I think it was pretty bold of her to publish that at the time when she did.
Hmm.
Um, I have a lot of respect for her. And I am glad that, you know, generally people who, even if they disagree with me, are still nice to me. So I have a lot of faith in the gardeners.
I have a couple of probably short answer, maybe technical questions.
Hmm.
One of those you mentioned chemical warfare, the invasives were engaging in, and I'm not sure what the latest research is on it, but allelopathy of garlic mustard,
Right.
um, has that been um discounted now, or do you know much about that?
There's a few different things that have been shown. One is that most of the strong results that we had on garlic mustard allelopathy were from lab studies.
Hmm.
And what would be done is they would create like a root exudate by concentrating the chemicals and then soaking seeds of plants in it, and they would see lower germination. But then they could not replicate those same results in the field because the
Interesting.
chemicals aren't concentrated to the same degree. And there's also a whole almost unknowably complex interplay of other soil flora. So there could
Mhm.
be other microorganisms that are counteracting it. There's native plants that are producing their own compounds. There was a study that I saw that was looking at garlic mustard allelopathy effects on native ginseng, and they found no effect from garlic mustard, but they did find a negative effect from a native striped violet on the ginseng. And then I've seen another study that shows that it seems like garlic mustard, having been here for, I think, 150 years, it seems that it is producing fewer of those chemicals, which might be a way that it is adapting to the landscape.
Mhm. Um, the other thing is, I'm not sure you'd consider it an invasive, but Nandina.
Hmm.
Um, the idea that if birds consume enough of those berries, they can suffer
That and
severe
someone just asked the same
consequences.
thing. Um, Someone just asked the same thing in the comments, so you have very good
Oh, okay.
timing.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
I have seen that reported, but I have not ever seen any confirmation of that actually happening. So I think it's something that is a theoretical problem, but most likely there's something in those fruits that indicates to the birds that it's not edible. Um, if someone knows of confirmed examples of cedar waxwings feeding on Nandina, please tell me, because I don't want to keep saying that if it's not true. But
It was
you have one?
Well, it was just the one confirmed incident in Georgia, I believe, that
Oh, okay.
has been reported on over and over again. Never happened again. But cedar waxwings also gorge on other things and have had
Hmm.
mass die outs because they're
Right.
they're bird brains. So, but they like
Yeah.
not the smartest.
Yeah.
So yeah. So it's like the dose is in the poison is in the dose,
Right.
the old adage, the cedar waxwing has not learned that because
Hmm.
they mass eat that. So that's what the problem is. It's not Nandina per se. And I don't think any home garden with one or two Nandina is going to be an issue. It would be like
Hmm.
if you had like, I don't know, a nursery or a public garden with a big swath of it, then you might be concerned.
Hmm.
We had
Yeah.
a speaker a while back who talked about that case in Georgia and commented that it was in an area where every garden had Nandina and they didn't
Hmm.
have a lot of options. And when you have one Nandina in your yard, they're likely to eat something else. Yeah.
Hmm.
Thank you
Yeah.
for bringing
I
that
think
up.
I think that's a good um place too to kind of mention. I think the solution to a lot of those stories is figure out what would be a good option and plant that instead to provide that. Like you said, um, potentially they were in what was essentially a food desert for them.
Yeah.
And so they gorge on something that is not a viable option. I think what I've started to try and do in my work is focus more on like joy and excitement and curiosity. There's still a lot of native bees that have very specific relationships with native plants. And so rather than telling people to hate garlic mustard, I would rather tell them to get excited about planting Claytonia if they want to potentially see this little native bee. Um, so I
Yeah,
think
it kind of it sort of leads to my question, which is, my perspective is that the news about the natural world is consistently and depressingly negative. Bird populations are down. Little brown bat. You just unlimited amount of bad news from the natural
mhm,
world. It's collapsing, maybe. I don't know, but I also look at it as what can an individual do about that? And if you're
mhm,
a, a landowner, do you just say, I can't do much about it? I'm going to have the showy hydrangea and, let someone else worry about natural world collapsing? Or should you say that, I can help this situation? I can plant natives. Where do you how does the homeowner, the landowner, small, quarter acre, half acre, 1 acre property owner, how do they fit into your framework of
yeah,
what you're speaking about, as
yeah. Well, they're
non-natives having benefit?
yeah. Well, they're most of my clients, so fortunately they do fit into my framework. Um,
Okay, that's
and
good.
again, like most of what I plant is native. Most of what I work with is native plants. But I'm not strict about whether they are state native or regionally native, or I'll use things from the Ozarks because I think they have good design value. I'm also not strict about local ecotypes because I don't think that the data on that is very conclusive in terms of support.
Hmm.
But I think the most important thing that I try and approach it as is um, I don't I don't begrudge anyone for not choosing to engage with it in that way. I have people who hire me, and I have sort of like a biased clientele because I have ecology in my business name. So people approach me because they want this specifically. But I have
Hmm.
people who will hire me and they want to increase pollinator value, and then they will almost apologize that they have a hydrangea. And I try and tell them, like, you don't need to apologize for your hydrangea. I have a hydrangea. Um, I don't think there's any, I don't think there's any convincing evidence that someone having a hydrangea um, is contributing to ecological collapse. I think the major problems are somewhat, very unfortunately, out of our control, like massive habitat fragmentation, massive scale industrial agriculture, massive climate change. Um, I don't think that people's planting choices are necessarily what are making or breaking ecological disaster. I think that
Mhm.
those planting choices can be a very good and healthy way to do something and specifically to like heal your own relationship with the natural world. You know, like if you are interested in this and you plant things and you start looking at pollinators, you are going to feel more connected to the natural world than if you have like a combative relationship to it.
Yeah,
I,
absolutely.
I hope that answered your question.
I think
Yeah.
that's
I,
wonderful. I was just talking to someone who said she got a plant. She's super excited. And I said, I think that needs to be dug and brought in the winter. And she said, oh, it's only an indoor potted plant. That's the only plant she has. And I was like, that's great. You're engaging. I love it,
Yeah.
but I wanted to ask a couple of questions that were in the chat. Um, Barkley wants to know how much do you pay attention to the noise on social media?
I'm very glad she asked that, and I'm glad you brought it back to it because the answer is too much. I try not to. I know that it is not good for me. Um, and I have learned to keep my social media. So that at the bottom there, that's my Instagram account. Um, I have learned the hard way to keep things positive there and to not engage in arguments on social media because it is not the place for it. Um, but I do see some of the messages that proliferate. Um, I see people, like I mentioned, a friend of mine who is, promoting planting this and not that, which is her prerogative, and that's fine. But then I see messages that I think are a little bit harmful where people will point to areas that have invasive plants and say, this is not natural anymore. This is essentially dead. And I know I have seen in a town that I lived in where developers will use that language to destroy forests. They'll say this has low ecological value because it's full of invasives. And if we've set that rhetoric up for them, it's then very hard to push back and say, like, well, we actually can work with this and preserve ecological value that's there and enhance it. Um, so yeah, the short, maybe not short answer to that question, how much do I pay attention to it, is I'm very aware of it, and I'm trying very hard to learn not to engage in it because it takes up way too much of my headspace when I would rather be out playing with my kids or something.
Agreed. And then Lynn asked that we ask on her behalf, what about the reports of cedar waxwings being poisoned by cyanide in Nandina berries? And I also wanted to note that Cindy and David pointed out that Nandina spreads by lateral roots from the mother plant, and the berries drop and seed prolifically, and that's where it's a problem. But a number of people have Nandinas and clip the shoots before they flower and set berry and manage the lateral roots so that they can maintain their Nandina without having it kind of take over other plants that they also want to maintain.
Yeah.
So I think you had kind of already addressed a lot of that, but I wanted to call out those comments in the chat. Um,
Yeah. And I think that approach I think is very perfect. Like that's a competitive plant. It's exhibiting competitive tendencies. Um, and I think I would rather people learn the behavior of that plant and learn how to work with it in their garden. Um, and then they can choose whether to grow it or not. But I think it's so much more useful to, engage with it as Cindy and David are, um, as a competitive plant and figure out how it can still be integrated in their garden without having any negative impacts.
Yeah, and I remember talking at a rose symposium that an entomologist came and said he rarely saw any insects on roses. And I
Mhm.
think that was probably true at the time, at least 10 years ago, because at the time most people were spraying their roses with
Right.
chemicals. But there's so many disease resistant roses now, and I don't spray, and I see insects all over them. So I think that was kind of it's not the rose, it was the fact that people were spraying. So I
Yeah.
think, looking at that holistic view matters.
hmm Yeah, and I've started to emphasize more like when I give talks on ecological garden design, that to my mind, like the way we manage our gardens and the way we put them together is just as, if not more important as plant selection. Like if we're choosing something for pollinator value, but then we're still spraying it, obviously we've negated any pollinator value it can have. Um, there's also something really interesting that happens where we know the longer, so we know two things that can potentially make a non-native plant have more relationships with particular. I use caterpillars as the example because they're sort of like the poster children of when we talk about the value of native plants. But it's true for pollinating insects as well. If a non-native plant has been here for longer, and if it is closely related to plants that are already here, or if it is very abundant, it's more likely to accumulate more relationships. So roses, we have native roses. They've been here for a long time, so it makes sense that that plant would start to build up ecological relationships. It's why clovers have so many ecological relationships. They've been here for a long time. They're in the pea family, which has a lot of close relatives, and there are a dozen species of clover that can be found anywhere. So to me, it's just fascinating. I think we should be curious about it.
Yeah, and I do see the spotted lanternfly. I see birds eating those now in my very urban garden surrounded by impervious surfaces. The birds are enjoying those spotted lanternflies. So I think
Yeah.
things do evolve. It's never consistent. So I love that slide with the cartoons of how land used to be managed. That was priceless.
Hmm.
Marjorie asked if there's a source of information for non-native plants, which are host plants. And I was reading a little bit about this topic on the sites that you've posted and others have posted, and it did talk about the fattiness of berries, and I think it did mention actually Nandina, that Nandina's berries didn't have as much fat content as some of the other berries that are uh, preferentially chosen by migrating birds because they really need that fat. But where would we go to look for information on non-native plants that do attract uh, a, a good insect community?
The best, so unfortunately, there's not yet like a very clear database where you can type in a plant name and see like insect relationships. You can look plant by plant and look up like pollinators that will visit it. Um, but there is a good database for like host plant relationships specifically for caterpillars and moths. Um, I'm gonna pull that up and send it to the chat. That
Great.
is, sorry, am I still here?
Yeah. I just said
Okay,
great. I'm
great.
sorry.
Okay, no, sorry. I thought I lost you.
I was overly exuberant.
So the Talamy paper that I mentioned before has a data set connected to it that they used to analyze that data, and I believe that is freely available. Um, I have access to all these things um, because I'm very lucky to work at a university. But um, I believe the Excel spreadsheet, and I think I linked to it in my Garden Rant article potentially, but I'm going to find the link. I'm going to put it right here because it is an Excel spreadsheet and it just lists the genus and then it lists the number of native Lepidopteran species that will feed on that genus. Um, this is not, for some reason, this website is not quite functioning right now. So rather than spending too much more time just staring at it, I'm going to send you.
Nathan, if you want to email it out, I'll share it with everybody.
I'll do
Oh,
that. So
there we
that's
go.
the link to the paper.
Hmm.
I don't know why the website is not working the right way right now, but if you look underneath the abstract of the paper under supporting information, there's a number of files, and those contain a spreadsheet that list genus by genus whether a plant is native or non-native or both. Um, and then it will tell you how many caterpillars are known to feed on it. Um, because it's such a incredibly wide volume of information, we usually only have the information at the genus level, but also most caterpillars are able to feed on multiple species within the same genus, or sometimes even within the same family. So that's what I work off of, and that I find is a very useful resource to kind of understand like differences in relationships with insects that some of these plants can have.
I was wondering how you feel about, I guess Doug Tallamy started it, but other people have taken it over, the homegrown national park idea. and I think Doug explained it as being um, outside of parks, there's just not enough habitat and land for um, high ecological functioning, so that you know individual small landowners can assist, I guess. I
Yeah. No, I think it's great. I mean, I think it's a good way to like see the impact that a lot of people are having across the country, to see that a lot of people are excited about it. I see those signs all over the place over here. So I think it's
hmm
fantastic.
How about a 70-30? I think that's what he recommends, native versus non-native proportions in your
Yeah,
plant selection.
I think that that is a like perfectly fine guideline to work off of. Um, but I don't want to discourage anyone from, adding anything to their yard if they're only interested in making some small changes. I don't want them to feel that they can only have an impact if they've hit like a certain number threshold. Um, I think it's a very useful shorthand. I heard someone say like two-thirds for the birds recently. And especially if you think of it as like two-thirds of the biomass of the plants in your landscape, then if you have a couple oak trees, then that's done quite a lot for the birds already.
Mm.
Um, so I think that that message can be really useful, especially when we think of it in terms of like the biomass of a tree and the value that can provide. Um, where it starts to bother me a little bit is, and I don't think that Doug Tallamy is doing this, but I think that sometimes it becomes like competitive or almost accusatory. Um, I
Mm.
saw like someone else created like a biodiversity score for landscapes where you can, and I think that they propose, I might be misremembering, but I think they proposed it in a way that like you can look at your own garden and tally up the number of native plants and give yourself a biodiversity score. And then you can do the same to your neighbor and like give them a bad biodiversity score to sort of shame them. Um, and I don't think that's productive. I don't think you're going to win people over by shaming them and attacking them.
Yeah, one more comment and then I'll shut up, which is,
Don't, no, you don't have to.
I think what from an overall perspective, I think the problem in America is that people aren't interested in this at all and have no awareness of it. I have neighbors here who spend hours running a mower over,
Mhm.
multiple acres of land, keeping it in turf, and unaware, unconcerned, and thinking, and this is something that maybe, and Doug has said this himself, people think this is the way to do it. The neighbors expect this, so it's sort of beyond what you're speaking about, but I do think that Americans' lack of interest in nature is and how that's expressed in their landscaping is probably almost a bigger problem than
Yeah.
invasives.
Yeah.
That goes back to educating our children, and that, people used to tell me that it was dangerous to let my kids play down by the creek. And I said, why? And they said, well, there's water down there and rocks. And I was like, and then another neighbor bought rocks off of Amazon with next day delivery, and they were rocks. It was for a management consulting team building exercise. He's like, I don't know what to do with this box of rocks now that I'm done with my team building exercise. I mean, just the idea that you would buy rocks, the whole thing was hilarious to me.
I'll
And I've
sell
been
you some
laughing about
rocks.
it. But they're in my rock garden now. The
Yeah.
rocks are safe. I've preserved them.
But Patrick, to your point, I agree completely. I think our largest problem is like complete disconnection from the natural world. Um,
Yeah.
and I'm encouraged by how many people are excited about this topic. if they disagree with me or not, they're passionate about it and they're engaged, and I think that's very encouraging.
Hmm.
Um, and I'm hopeful that we can get more people excited and connected because I think it's the source of a lot of problems that we have like lost a relationship with the natural world. Um,
Yes.
and I've felt myself like rebuild it, and I've felt how helpful that's been to me personally, and I hope more people come around to it.
I'd like to make a comment on this dialogue between you and Patrick, because I think what it points out to me is that, as you said in your presentation, what we're talking about tonight is very complex. But for my neighbors who really don't know what they're doing, even entering into garden has the same level of complexity. My response to Patrick's "What can we do?" is just the more lawn we make go away, the more insects we have in our yard. And we have developed a habit now of dividing things and putting them in the street, and our neighbors come by and take those plants and plant them in their yards. And in that way, we create a greater dialogue with the adults in our community who don't know how to garden. And it's created a lovely feeling in our community. And I want to just go on to say that for that reason, Nathan, I am especially grateful for your sensitivity to language, because I think this language has divided us as gardeners, and we need to just get back to sharing plants with one another and telling people not to worry if that first one died, something else will take hold. Gardening is such a joy, and we needn't divide our hearts between what's okay and what's not okay. We just need to do more. And that history of the language, I was just dumbstruck by your analysis of how the language has created division, and we need to. I'm just awed by your presentation, Nathan. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. That's very kind of you to say. I really
I
appreciate
agree
it.
with Lana that that was awesome, and her comments were perfect. I am gonna see if there are any last comments before we wrap up tonight, and to thank Nathan for his most excellent presentation and discussion.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I will share the recording probably in the morning to be posted. Thank you, Pat, and Barkley for doing that. And Nathan, you'll get a follow-up email for me. And thank you all so much for participating tonight.
Thank you
Okay.
very much. It was such a warm welcome. I've really enjoyed this.